CTE is still destroying fighters. So is there anything we can do? A couple weeks ago, I did a video on Tony Ferguson, and many pointed out that CTE could be a possible cause for his recent DUI and crash. Additionally, in that video, we explored that Tony has had a history of having manic and paranoid behavior. And this type of behavior that probably stems from CTE is still, for many fighters, a very big concern. In a survey done by The Athletic to gauge the concern of post-fighting career injuries, a whopping 61% of fighters answered that they are very concerned about long-term brain damage in their career, and already 21% of fighters claim that brain trauma or CTE is affecting their daily life. So with this much concern from fighters and fans, is there a way we can prevent CTE? Well, first, let's get into what it is exactly. CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is a degenerative brain disease found in anyone who has taken repeated trauma to the head. In this video, we'll be focusing on the CTE cases that impact athletes, specifically fighters and football players, as those sports naturally produce more events in which athletes experience head trauma. According to the Concussion Foundation, CTE causes a buildup of protein called tau in the brain, which eventually malfunctions and causes other protein around it to malfunction and eventually die, which literally leads to the brain shrinking. Though we can't truly confirm if someone has had CTE until they have died and their brain has been studied, there are many clear symptoms for those potentially suffering from CTE. The early symptoms of CTE arise in a patient's early 20s and 30s, and this is where the behavioral changes occur. These symptoms include paranoia, impulse control problems, aggression, mood swings, depression, and anxiety. If we look at the case of Tony, all of these symptoms look consistent with Tony's wife's claims of manic behavior and severe paranoia. Tony's wife claimed Tony was extremely paranoid, believing there was a computer chip in his leg and that someone was inside the family's walls, which led him to destroy the walls. Tony's wife even had to get a restraining order on Tony that has since been dropped back in 2019 due to Tony's behavior. Tony's wife has also said he's been suffering from this type of behavior ever since his appearance on The Ultimate Fighter, meaning his whole career he has probably been suffering from CTE, and with each fight has made it worse and worse. Again, we can't really confirm whether or not Tony has CTE until he is dead, but considering his fighting style, namely the punishment he takes in his fights, I mean just go watch the Justin Gaethje fight, Tony's behavior is most likely due to CTE. And though not a UFC fighter or an actual combat sports athlete, the story of Chris Benoit is still probably the most well-known and shocking case of CTE's early stages of behavioral changes, paranoia, and violence. If you haven't heard the story by now, Chris Benoit was a professional wrestler in the WWE who killed his wife, his child, and eventually himself. You can watch these videos on his death, as I won't get into the details, but Chris Benoit is probably the worst case of CTE's behavioral symptoms. Despite not taking any real punches or kicks, Chris Benoit after his death was confirmed to have a severe case of CTE and had a brain equivalent to an 80-year-old with Alzheimer's. Again, he never took any real punches or kicks, but considering his signature move was literally called the diving headbutt, I would assume this is where his CTE stemmed from. The case of Chris Benoit is always a reminder of how extreme CTE can change one's behavior and mental state. So if someone gets past the violence and paranoia in their early 20s and 30s, the next symptoms come in the patient's 40s, 50s, and 60s, and this includes short-term memory loss, slurring of words, dementia, and just overall loss of cognitive function. In a video by MMA Fighting, Spencer Fisher, a former UFC lightweight who took major damage in his career, details his life after fighting. His career ended when doctors found lesions or damage in his brain, and they also found that he had dementia. He has since described his life after fighting with a lot of depression, dizzy spells, forgetting his kids' names on the spot, and having short-term memory loss. His quality of life in this video just seems horrible, and simple cognitive functions seems very difficult for him. Despite being only 47 years old, his life seems more in tune with a 70 or 80-year-old with severe dementia. Another example of the long-term effects of CTE is Gary Goodrich, who was an MMA heavyweight who fought in the early days of the UFC in Pride, and whose last 3 fights ended in TKO losses. A video by Invicta Fighting Championship documented Gary Goodrich's day-to-day after fighting, and like Fisher, experienced short-term memory loss, depression, and was prescribed many pills to restrain him from beating people. So from these 2 videos, you can see firsthand how depressing and deteriorating CTE can be on a former combat sports athlete. So how can this be solved? In the NFL, when Junior Seau himself in 2011, his brain revealed that he had severe CTE, and the depression that led to his suicide was likely a symptom from CTE. This was just after Dave Durson's death, who, like Junior Seau, himself. However, the remarkable thing about Dave Durson was that he knew there was something wrong with him in the head, and before his death, texted family members to donate his brain to be studied. And sure enough, he was found with CTE. So because of these tragic deaths, the NFL has changed its helmets and made rules that prevent violent head clashes like targeting. But what about the UFC? I mean, the whole point of the UFC is to beat your opponent, and hitting to the head is a big part of the sport. And if we introduce headgear, I know fans and fighters will be pissed. People will call the change ridiculous and soft. And furthermore, what if I were to tell you the headgear wouldn't really make a difference to preventing CTE? There has been many claims by the bare knuckle community that bare knuckle boxing is safer than traditional boxing or MMA or any combat sport that uses gloves in terms of brain damage. This study referenced by the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship president says that concussions happen less often in bare knuckle in comparison to glove boxing or MMA. This study observed bare knuckle, glove boxing, and MMA matches for a 2-year time span from 2018 to 2020 and showed that the percentage of fighters that received concussions in bare knuckle was significantly less than fighters in glove boxing or MMA. Now, there isn't any specific reasoning as to why this is, but I can try to reason why. Though bare knuckle doesn't produce more concussions, it does produce much more lacerations to the face, and fights just look more bloody than glove matches. Because of this, fights can end quicker. CTE, ironically enough, is more of a death by 1,000 cuts disease, meaning CTE is caused by consistent, repeated head trauma rather than a couple big blows. Because boxing and UFC matches last for much longer due to gloves preventing cuts, the constant amount of punches, big or small, start to add up to the brain. Remember when I said headgear wouldn't make a difference? Well, I can argue it's making the situation worse. Though headgear can prevent concussions and absorb damage to the head, it can't prevent concussions or damage entirely. Because of the false sense of security headgear can have, some boxers or UFC fighters in sparring may go to the head much more often, and these repeated head blows can add up more damage long term than a couple big hits to the head without headgear that may end the sparring match entirely. So I honestly think the true culprit of CTE is sparring. Again, I'm no expert, but considering that most UFC fighters fight 2 or 3 times a year, I don't think the damage in the octagon is what's ultimately giving them CTE. Though the damage they do take in the octagon is definitely not helping. It's most likely due to the rounds and rounds of sparring some of these guys are doing. Max Holloway, someone who stopped sparring altogether, described that most fighters' injuries result from rounds and rounds of hard sparring. Manny Pacquiao is another person who's described that he's done 36 rounds of sparring at a time when he was at his prime. And guys who come from a background of Dutch kickboxing like Alistair Overeem know that they do hard sparring practically every single day. From what I could gather from Max Holloway and other professionals who talk about sparring is that there seems to be a culture for young fighters to spar hard, a lot of rounds, and again, because of the false sense of security headgear, gloves, and shin guards give you, it can make you think you can take a lot of blows to the head. So though we can't really change the UFC rules to prevent CTE, I think fighters need to change the culture of sparring, especially when you're young. And I think guys like Max Holloway, Conor McGregor, and Georges St. Pierre recognize this. Conor had a great quote on this, and he said, "When training, you must upgrade the software without damaging the hardware." And GSP has also said, a lot of guys' career live out in the gym, and whenever he spars younger guys, he calls it playing around instead of sparring. So if my theory of sparring being the true culprit of CTE is correct, I hope the culture of sparring in combat sports, especially when fighters are younger, can change so that fighters don't go through what Tony and many other athletes go through in their career. So what do you guys think? Is there any rules in the UFC that we can change to prevent CTE? Or is CTE something that fighters just have to risk and something inevitable in their career? Again, thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.